For those who are skeptical about the rise in sea level caused by global warming, here are some scientific predictions that were made. So we were told sea levels would rise and we'd to evacuate the coasts. Let's take a look here. Sydney Harbor, 140 years. He predicted that within 30 years, i.e. this year, Lower Manhattan would be underwater. And here's how scientists measure that sea level rise. Just there. It's going up by about a millimeter. Rising sea level. You got it? Ivy got it. 3 mil. Well, no prizes for guessing. This isn't how they measure sea level rise, and these aren't scientific predictions. They read just what bloggers and pundits think scientific predictions and measurements are, because when they do their own research, they don't check scientific studies to find out. They just get their information from other shows, books, newspaper columnists, and bloggers. We'll take a look at the real scientific predictions and how sea level rise is being measured later in the video. Why do the critics do it? Well, of course, it's a very old tactic, taking a leaf out of the creationist manual. Invent your own science. Create your own scientist, even. Make his claims as stupid as possible. I think what you must remember is that as true scientists, we are constantly searching for evidence. Prove that which we already believe to be truth, and then amaze your audience with your skill in demolishing them. So if the science critics aren't explaining what the science says, where do you go? The same place real scientists go when they want to look at the latest discoveries in their field, respected peer-reviewed scientific journals. And if you find these rather daunting, then get your information from reputable science media where these studies are accurately reported and cited. Now you may not trust or believe the studies. Maybe you think they are part of a huge worldwide conspiracy, but at least you will know what they actually say instead of relying on spurious blogs and news pundits to misinform you about what they say. Before we look at the fallacies, let's start with the basics. Why are sea levels rising and expected to rise further as the Earth heats up? The most obvious reason is that higher temperatures mean more ice is melting, which I'm sure makes perfect sense even to people who never studied science. How long will it take for the sea level to rise 2 feet? Think about it. If your ice cube melts in your glass, it doesn't overflow, it's a displacement. This is the thing, some of the things that they talking about mathematically and scientifically don't make sense. They don't make sense to one person who never studied science. So for Congressman Stockman's benefit, I'll explain the physics in words of one syllable because it really is that simple. Land, ice, melt, fill, rise. Think about it. If your ice cube melts in your glass, it doesn't overflow. But the great thing about basic physics is that you can do a lot of the experiments yourself. Put a draining board to represent Greenland over a glass, put some ice on it to represent Greenland's ice cap, and what do you get? Ice melt, fill, rise. The real lesson from this is that any time a politician tells you he's spotted a flaw in the laws of physics that scientists have overlooked, put your money on the scientists, knowing something he don't. Like all good science, this melt isn't just obvious in theory, it can be measured and quantified in practice. For example, a satellite system called GRACE constantly records the mass of ice on top of Greenland using a gravitometer. Research has found that Greenland has been losing around 255 billion tons of ice every year. That means the amount of ice lost through melting and ablation, minus the amount gained through precipitation. Green glaciers are also contributing a huge amount to sea level rise. There are about 200,000 glaciers worldwide, covering roughly 10 of the Earth's surface. Outside of Greenland, Glaciers are losing some 267 billion tons of ice every year, contributing to a rise of about 0.7 in sea levels annually, 20 of the total rise. The other half of the rise, less well known, is the expansion of water as it gets warmer. The fact that the oceans are getting warmer has been directly measured, and the fact that warming water expands is another well-known principle of physics. And again, you can actually do this experiment yourself to be sure it's not just a conspiracy by 18th century scientists who first discovered it. Just follow the instructions. There are a couple of other factors. One is terrestrial storage. So during extensive flooding in Pakistan in 2010, sea level actually fell temporarily. But these ups and downs don't change the long-term picture. And sea level is also affected by eustatic changes, movement of the land rising and falling. A failure to understand this eustatic movement has often led to fallacious news reports from Reuters and others claiming ridiculously high rises in sea level because in this case the reporter was unaware that the crustal plate on which she is standing has been subsiding. Scientists, on the other hand, factor these eustatic changes into their measurements. The amount of melting ice from Greenland and glaciers outside Greenland is accelerating at the high end of predictions. And this, combined with a more rapid expansion of warmer water, has led to an acceleration in sea level rise over the last few decades. If we go back to the end of the last glaciation, after a 400th rise due to melting ice sheets, there hasn't been much of a change in sea level for the last 3,700 years. This can be determined by taking sediment cores from coastal zones, dating coral growth rates and other techniques that, put together, show a picture of a very small and steady rise of less than a millimeter a year. But during the 20th century, when global temperatures went up significantly, sea level rise more than doubled from 0.8 m a year to 1.9 m a year, then accelerated again to 3.0 m a year. And sea level is currently rising around 3.6 m a year. So basic physics tells us a hotter climate should be raising sea levels, as we've seen it do in the past. In fact, those who dispute that really need to explain how it's possible that warmer water and melting ice would not cause sea level to rise, but they do raise a legitimate question. If sea level really is rising at over 3 m a year, how come we can't see it in old photos? This photo has been passed around Facebook and Twitter for years, showing, apparently, a rise of 0.0 in sea levels, in other words, 0. If whoever produced this photo is measuring sea level rise to the nearest 0.0, that's a millimeter, it means that he's got a sight keen enough to determine that the level of water on the right is less than half a millimeter higher than the level of water on the left. Well done to whoever managed that, but that isn't a science. That's called doing your own research. For a start, there's a half-meter tidal variation at Sydney Harbour, where this photo was taken. So the photo on the left could have been taken at high tide, and the photo on the right at low tide, meaning sea level has risen about half a meter. There's no evidence of exactly when during that tidal cycle the photo was taken. Facebook users can't even agree on the year the photo was taken, and as is pretty obvious, even the wave height varies between the two pictures. But it's an interesting example of what happens when you do your own research. In the do your own research world, there's no need for accurate measurements and accurate recorded data collection. In the science world, researchers have been measuring sea level rise in Sydney Harbour since 1886, In fact, right here at Fort Denison. Before sophisticated instruments came along, they used a simple measuring rule inside a stilling well, which minimized the impact of waves. In the 1960s they measured more accurately with microwave radar scanners, but these were fixed on land, so it was hard to determine whether the sea was rising or the land was sinking. So these older measurements now have to be adjusted to take account of land movement. It was only in the 1990s that satellites were able to measure sea level rise with millimeter precision irrespective of changes in land elevation. According to this study, the sea level at Fort Denison has risen around 0.9 m a year over the last 100 years and around 0.63 m a year before that, going back to 1886. Of course, I'm sure those who thought this photo is how sea level is measured are already furiously typing posts saying 0.6 to 0.9 m a year. That's Stani. But before you hit the send button, let me first say I'm delighted you now accept actual scientific measurements instead of do your own research Facebook memes, because clearly that 0.0 claim was nonsense. And secondly, I haven't quite finished. We have to follow the science further. These are past sea level rises in Sydney Harbor, and like everywhere else, the rise is accelerating. So, of course, past sea level rise is a lot less than current sea level rise. Also, Sydney Harbor is part of an area where sea levels are rising a lot slower than other parts of the world, like regions of the United States and Canada. As if sea level around us could somehow be different than it is in the rest of the world. Yes, I know, if you do your own research in a bathtub, ocean water should rise at exactly the same rate everywhere. In the science world, even if you believe the rate of rise ought to be evenly distributed, you still have to measure it and find out. And when all the measurements are collected all over the world, this is the picture that emerges. The areas in red are where sea level is rising fastest, in blue it's rising slowest. Anyway, now that we've seen what the rate of sea level rise was in the past and what it is now, according to measurements rather than guesses, let's move on to what it's going to do in the future. Who can we get that information from? Of course, an actor and theater technician. He should know. Let's see now, 3 m a year. That means in 100 years. No, you can't work it out in your head, Bill. It's not as if you can simply multiply 3 by 100. These are just a couple of the equations required to estimate thermospheric sea level rise, which is the rise due to the expansion of warmer water. Then on top of that, you need to apply calculus to work out the response of sea level to past temperature rise, and a whole load more measurements and calculations to work out how much ice will melt from Greenland and thousands of glaciers in response to future atmospheric and ocean temperature rises. I wish I had a science guy here to check me numbers. Oh God, you're not really going to just multiply 3 by 100, are you? We'll be up to. Don't say 300. Don't say 300. 300. No. Boy, that's 11.8 inches. That's almost a foot. Seriously, this is why science should be left to the professionals, not YouTubers who've never studied science past junior high school and do their own research. By the way, I've covered this claim by Bill Whittle before in another video, as well as a few of the other myths and facts about sea level rise, but I thought it worth bringing them all together into this video. Now, I'm sure Bill Whittle is very talented in the field he chose to study, which was theater, and I'm happy to admit that's a subject I know nothing about. But that doesn't qualify him to calculate future glacial melt, ocean temperature profiles, and thermospheric expansion, as he clearly showed. And Bill isn't kidding. He really does think he's worked out future sea level rise. I did study science, and even I can't work all that stuff out. To show why you can't simply multiply 3 by 100, let's start with the easy part. The difference between a linear curve and a geometric curve. In other words, the difference between velocity and acceleration. If I measure the velocity of a stone a fifth of a second after I drop it from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, its velocity would be around 1.96 meters a second. Since the top of the tower is 57 meters high, then according to Bill Whittle's formula of simple arithmetic, it should take 29 seconds before it hits the ground. That's an awfully long time. So how come in real life it can be measured and it only takes about 3.4 seconds? The answer is that it did to stay at a constant velocity of 1.96 meters per second during the entire fall. It accelerated. This was first discovered by Galileo over 400 years ago. Over 400 discovered by Galileo. No, there's no evidence he dropped anything from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but he did set up a clever experiment to measure the acceleration of a rolling ball. And thanks to this set of equations, we can work out exactly what speed it will be and what distance it will have covered over a given period of time. The same goes for a linear versus geometric growth. If it was a simple case of projecting a straight line into the future, then anyone with a fifth-grade science education could do that with a ruler and pencil. But a geometric curve, which is an acceleration, is more complicated. Scientists have to figure out not just what the rate of melt and thermosteric expansion is, but they also have to work out the rate at which it's accelerating. So what have real scientists found? If you get your science from popular media, then the conclusions of scientists are rather confusing. If Greenland broke up and melted, or if half of Greenland and half of West Antarctica broke up and melted, this is what would happen to the sea level in Florida. So we were told sea levels would rise and we'd have to evacuate the coasts. These are two opposite ends of the spectrum. This guy seems to think that scientists were predicting that we'd have to evacuate the coasts by 2018, presumably all of them. Presumably. Say to 20. And since we haven't evacuated all the coasts, he concludes that the science must be wrong. And this guy doesn't say when these huge sea level rises will happen, so a lot of people assume that Al Gore was talking about this century. Now it's true that studies show sea level will rise by this much if and when Greenland's ice melts, but they conclude that's many hundreds of years into the future. Not a good thing, obviously, but the timescale needs to be made clear. So let's get our predictions from scientific studies rather than videos and movies. Researchers used two completely different methods to work out how far and how fast sea levels will rise into the future. One method is to look at where sea level was when the Earth was at the same temperature in the past, taking account of few static changes. The other is to calculate the extra volume of water from thermosteric expansion and ice melt. How fast sea levels continue to rise obviously depends on how much cotton we pump into the atmosphere. So there are different scenarios for different outcomes. Obviously, if we follow the do your own research path where cotton doesn't cause warming, and even if it does cause warming, that'll be a good thing, and even if it's a bad thing, there isn't any why would we about it where something we can do about it. Well, we will by the wheels so there will well fail my will do fail well fail you well fail well power well Bill, but the whale, whoa, but assuming some action is taken to drastically curb Kotu output under the most likely scenario called 4.5, then we all see a rise of about 3ft. And of course sea level want to stop rising just because we hit that magical date with 2 zeros in it. Even if we reduce worldwide carbon emissions to zero by 2100, temperature will keep rising because of what's called positive feedback. So it'll take decades before the Earth reaches its new stable equilibrium temperature, which will be over 3 under 4.5, that's about 6. Researchers have found that the last time the Earth hit that kind of temperature during the Pliocene more than 2.5 million years ago, sea levels were 16-62 higher. But it's not going to happen overnight. If you fill a swimming pool with cold water on a warm day, it takes time for the water to warm up. And if you put an ice sculpture under the hot sun, it takes a long time for it to melt. So even when the Earth reaches its new equilibrium temperature, perhaps 6 higher than it is today, sea level will keep rising for hundreds of years. That means the lives of people 2, 4, or even 10 generations into the future will depend on the decisions we take now. Now 3 feet may not seem like much up against a 20-foot tower or a cliff face. That's because these structures are rising vertically. However, along most of the shoreline, the land is sloping or even flat. So there the 3 feet rise would send seawater dozens or even hundreds of feet inland. And unfortunately, flat coastal land and estuaries are precisely where we've decided to build most of our expensive and densely populated infrastructure. But was New York supposed to be already underwater by now? I've been getting comments on the channel from people who really believe this was a scientific prediction. Apparently in 1988, James Hansen said Lower Manhattan would be underwater by 2018. Wait, no. Hansen said all of Manhattan will be underwater by 2018, and that's supported by an impeccable source, a blog. And as long as we're remaking stuff up, let's say his prediction was that the whole of New York will be underwater by 2018. Better yet, he predicted that the entire city of New York would vanish overnight. And where did he make this prediction that Lower Manhattan or the whole of New York would be underwater by midnight on December 31st, 2017? Why, it's all over the web, where people go to do their own research. So if this really was a scientific prediction, then why isn't the West Side Highway underwater? To bust the myth, we first have to track down the source. Let's ask someone who always gives his source, but never properly reads or fact checks it. Here's another James Hansen forecast from 1988. He predicted that within 30 years, i.e. this year, Lower Manhattan would be underwater. Good old Tony Heller. So this wasn't a scientific study at all. It was speculation by Hansen in a magazine. Or was it? No, turns out Salon magazine never even talked to Hansen. They interviewed a journalist, Bob Rice, who was recalling a conversation he had had with Hansen 12 or 13 years earlier for an upcoming book. As Rice remembered it, they were in Hansen's office in Lower Manhattan, and Rice told Salon magazine this: "I went over to the window with him and looked down on Broadway in New York City and said, if what you saying about the greenhouse effect is true, is anything going to look different down there in 20 years? Hansen said that the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, will be underwater." Tony Heller didn't find this Salon magazine interview himself. He copied it off the blogosphere. It had been circulating ever since a blogger called Anthony Watts discovered the article in 2009. As we've seen, there were lots of embellishments and changes along the way. So in 1988, he predicted that Lower Manhattan would be underwater within 30 years. 30 years. I thought Tony Heller had just read the article out loud and Rice had said it was 20 years. So why did Tony Heller change it? Well, it goes all the way back to that first blog by Anthony Watts. He got his sums wrong. Since the magazine interview was in 2001 and Rice said his interview with Hansen had been 12 to 13 years earlier, that would mean the prediction was made around 1988. 1988 plus 20 years makes too slow. Bill, 2008. Unfortunately, when Watts added 20 to 1988, he mistakenly got 2018. So that date was copied and pasted by other bloggers. When it was Tony Heller's turn to copy the myth, he could see the dates didn't add up. But the first rule of doing your own research is never question the blogosphere. Once a myth is set in stone, you can't correct it. So Tony decided instead to change the time period that was spelled out in the magazine that he did just read out loud, and that allowed him to dutifully follow the line that Hansen's prediction was for 2018. For over the predict It's a classic case of changing the evidence to fit the conclusion, even when you know the conclusion is wrong. Don't you just love how the blogosphere works? The funny thing is, Hansen didn't say 20 years or 30 years. Despite being copied on the blogosphere hundreds of times, no one thought to check with Hansen to confirm that's what he actually said, or check with Rice's book to see if Rice had remembered the conversation correctly. As it turned out, he had. Rice later admitted he was being interviewed on the telephone, and he didn't have his notes, so he got the details wrong. After checking with his own book, he said his question was what the view would be like outside the window in 40 years with doubled Catu. So this is what's in the book. Hansen's own recollection of the conversation was exactly the same as the book that Rice had asked him to speculate on changes that might happen in New York City in 40 years, assuming Catu doubled in amount. Double Catu concentration means a doubling from pre-industrial levels of around 265 parts per million to 530 parts per million. Rice might be forgiven for thinking that figure would be reached by 2028, because in 1988 Katoa emissions were rising uncontrollably, and without governments agreeing to curb the emissions, they were on the path of this black line. But thanks to the Kyoto Protocol, Katoa is now at around 415 parts per million following the red line. So it looks like we'll hit the double Katoa concentration point around 2060 to 2070. If every nation adheres to Paris Climate Agreement targets, then a doubling of Katoa concentration could be pushed back even further. So now that we understand what the question was Hansen's answer correct? Well, of course, we don't know until Katoa concentration doubles. My sources are in the video description, and they suggest that at the time Katoa concentration doubles, sea level will have risen about 0.2 to 0.6 meters. Is that enough to cover the West Side Highway? Well, no good looking at this highway cam, because this isn't the West Side Highway Hansen was talking about. This is the new highway. It was built on top of the old highway that Hansen was pointing to in 1988 or 1989. I don't know the elevation of that highway, so I don't know if the sea will have covered some parts of it or all of it. Unless someone does a proper peer-reviewed study, then this isn't a scientific study. It's pointless and groundless speculation. Of course, decades later, a doubling of Katoa concentration will very likely lead to a rise in sea level of several meters according to real scientific studies, more than enough to cover most of lower Manhattan. This is what it would look like when sea level rise is just 8 feet. But that isn't the prediction Hansen made. He didn't say a doubling of Katoa concentration will cause the West Side Highway to be inundated. He said the West Side Highway will be inundated when Katoa levels double. Not just part of it, and not just some of the time. And that seems to contradict most scientific projections. It emphasizes my point that scientists should indulge in speculation without reference to a proper scientific study, and why Rice shouldn't invite or publish that kind of speculation in a book that's supposed to be reporting the facts about climate change. James Hansen is a great scientist, but he's not an oracle. A scientist is only as good as the research that supports his conclusions. If there is any supporting research published in a respected peer-reviewed scientific journal, then proclamations count for nothing, no matter the status of the scientist making them. If you want to know what the scientific predictions are, read the scientific literature. The date the West Side Highway, or any other piece of coastal infrastructure, actually gets submerged is really not that relevant, because houses, highways, hospitals, and railways will be affected long before they are physically inundated. Venice, for example, is yet under water, but floods are becoming more common with each storm surge and each exceptionally high tide. Coastal areas and islands are increasingly having to deal with storm surges and salination, which is why people are moving long before the water actually permanently covers their homes. I've looked at this in me video on the Maldives, busting yet another vlogger who did his own research by reading spurious tabloid newspapers rather than scientific studies. So if you're going to do your own research, first of all, understand that geophysics is a lot more complicated than just multiplying one number by another. Secondly, if you want to do your own research to find out what scientific predictions are, then read the scientific predictions like the studies listed in the video description. Don't just trust blogs, books, tweets, and tabloids to tell you, because here's the shocker: they aren't always accurate. My thanks to all those who've been donating to this charity in order to support me channel. Unlike many YouTubers and bloggers who are pushing their own junk research, I don't do this for money, and I don't ask for money. I've had trouble naming the charity as the beneficiary of monetization of this channel, which is why it's still ad-free, but your generous contributions alone have now raised nearly $200,000 for Health in Harmony. Health in Harmony provides health care to communities near rainforests in exchange for an end to logging, because the reason so many people cut down trees in this area is because health care is unaffordable. So it, a charity that saves lives, improves health, and helps preserve the rainforest, not to mention that your donation will encourage me to keep my channel going. So it's a win, 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 win. You tired of winning yet?